Nice. Yeah.
Yes, indeed.
How was your trip over?
Yeah, it was great. I just arrived like 30 minutes
Oh
ago.
my God. Okay, I'll let you get ready, and I'll see you afterwards.
Thanks, Cynthia.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? We're also happy you came to hear this spring's lecture in criticism. I'm Juliette Floyd, the current director of the Boston University Center for the Humanities. This lecture series is the most prestigious event that our center puts on. For over 40 years, the most distinguished cultural critics have spoken in this series. It's a very long list, but just as examples, Carol Jacobs, Richard Gilman, Rebecca West, William Gass, Toro Moy, Sharon Cameron, Slavoj Žižek, Martha Nussbaum, W.T. Mitchell, Malcolm Bradbury. So anyone who was here. And it seems to me that nothing could be more important now than criticism. So at this remarkable and I think very frightening juncture in the history of the United States. We do need, as members of the university community, to step up and defend what we do as performing essential matters for everyone, teaching the practice of good criticism, learning to speak across difficult divides, instilling the capacity to articulate, envision, and achieve resilience, insight, receptivity, and a moral sense of justice and creativity in our institutions, in our communities of thought, and in our multi-generational work. The BU Center for the Humanities sponsors 2 lectures in criticisms each year. One is given in the fall generally, that's an in-house senior faculty member, and one is from a scholar outside of BU. Last year we had a talk from Louis Chudy-Soke, who's professor of English and director of BU's African American and Black Diasporic Studies program, a fascinating lecture on race and technology. Today we host another Nigerian-born speaker who was born similarly to Louis in the dangerous time of the Biafran War, which for me, I was born in 1960, the images of the Biafran War are seared in my memory in perhaps some of the ways what's happening around the world today in Gaza will be seared in yours. Professor Chika Okeke Agulu is well known to our colleagues in the history of art and architecture. He's professor of art and archaeology and African American studies at Princeton. He's an eminent visionary. He's an artist, I think the first artist to speak in our lecture and criticism series. He's also a critic and an art historian of indigenous, modern, and contemporary African and African diasporic art history and theory. Professor Okeke Agulu was born in Umuahia, Nigeria, graduating as class valedictorian at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, with a focus on sculpture. Afterwards, he earned an MFA in painting. In 1996, he became an activist and conscientious objector, and he had to leave Nigeria because, with 12 others, he refused to sign an oath to the dictatorship's demand that he pledge good behavior, an act that eventually carried a death sentence for 8 of the resistors. With civil disobedience carrying such a penalty, he traveled to enroll at the University of Florida, where he received an MA in art history, later taking his PhD in art history at Emory University. He has worked tirelessly to pull art history beyond traditional African art toward consideration of contemporary African art. He has mounted exhibitions and became the first to consistently publish articles about African, African-American, African diasporic artists, including his great teacher, El Anatsui. He's helped to raise the recognition of African art internationally and works tirelessly in that regard as well. Only 4 African nations participated in the Venice Biennale in 2011, but last year, thanks in part to his good work, there were 12. Professor Okeke Agulu is a leading voice in the call for the restitution to Nigeria of the Benin so-called bronzes, including thousands of figurines, tusks, plaques, and masks. The objects were looted by British soldiers from the kingdom in 1897, and they're still held today in museum collections worldwide. Professor Okeke Agulu has taught at Pennsylvania State University, the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and is now director of the program in African Studies and director of the African World Initiative at Princeton University. He has a very long list of visiting professorships: Williams College, New York University, Oxford. He's a fellow of the British Academy. Art News, the oldest and most widely circulated art magazine in the world, has recently called him massively influential. His books include El Anatsui, The Reinvention of Sculpture, African Artists from 1882 to Now, Yusef Griot, Painting, Lagos, Life, Obiora Udechukwu, Line, Image, Text, Post-Colonial Modernism, Art and Decolonization in 20th Century Nigeria, and Contemporary African Art since 1980. He's very active as a curator and exhibitor. There will be a show next year at the Philadelphia Art Museum that he's putting together now. Some of the other exhibitions include Samuel Fosso Affirmative Acts at the Princeton Art Museum, the traveling survey El Anatsui Triumphant Scale in the Haus der Kunst Munich, Who Knows Tomorrow, National Gallery Berlin, and so on. At the moment, Professor Okeke Agulu is working on a book-length study of art during late 20th century military dictatorships in Nigeria. And he's preparing an exhibition of the work of the Nigerian artist, Obiora Udechukwu. He will be speaking to us today about the material for that new book, which, as we face the current spectator dictatorship here, right now, in the United States, seems to me could not be more relevant. His title is Art in the Shadow of Military Dictatorships in 1980s Nigeria. Please join me in welcoming Chika Okeke Agulu.
Thank you so much, Professor Floyd, for that introduction. I'm happy to be here this afternoon, and I begin with a thanks to Professor Floyd, the director of the Center for Humanities, but also the executive committee that was responsible for inviting me to give this talk. I also want to thank Kurt Cavender and Ashley. Where is Ashley? Is she here? Okay. For making my travel arrangements and organizing today's program. my meeting with grad students tomorrow. I truly appreciate this opportunity to be at BU for the very first time. So today I want to share one aspect of an ongoing work on art, power, and politics in post-colonial Africa. Before the present research, I had spent a good part of my scholarship on what I called post-colonial modernism, invested in the description and analysis of the role of political independence and decolonization, the role they played in the development by Africa's most ambitious artists of formal languages expressive of the state of sovereignty that defined their world in the mid-20th century. In that work, I argued that artists were part of a post-colonial elite committed to the task of building a new independent nation state, as well as progressive national cultures that might secure the gains of hard-won political freedom for their societies. But while that line of argument implied a unified sense of purpose on the idea, construct, and direction of these new imagined communities among the political, artistic, and cultural elite, I was aware that indeed, more often than not, these independence era ideals fizzled out in the face of the continent's more complex and difficult post-colonial history and experience. For just as the nation state set about the business of self-governance, often with euphoric grand visions of progress, there emerged new figures of power, some charismatic, others not, who seized power by manipulating the political process or by forceful expulsion of extant governments and refashioned the nation state in their own image. I designate this figure the big man, after the American anthropologist Marshall Sahlins, who in 1963 first described a type of self-serving, charismatic leader in Micronesia where political legitimacy is not so much sanctioned by tradition as by his ability to deploy diverse forms of coercion and suppressive acts against any opposition. This post-colonial African big man, who might be called strongman, autocrat, big shot, warlord, dictator, in fact played decisive roles in determining the fate of Africa after independence, and by default shaped the work of the modernists who, I argue in this study, had to reposition their work to critical engagement with the politics and policies of the big man in their various countries. I suggest that in view of the politics associated with the Africa's big men, that it might inform a new appreciation of the diverse work produced by the continent's leading artists during the second half of the 20th century. So in this lecture, I focus on Nigeria in the 1980s and 90s to consider the fate of art and the broader critical culture during three repressive military dictatorships exemplified by the regime of General Ibrahim Babangida, the self-described evil genius. I focus on the work of a nationally acclaimed University of Nigeria Nsukka-based painter and poet, Obiora Udechukwu, who then was at the height of his powers with drawings, paintings, and poetry, celebrated for their lyrical power and trenchant social commentary. I examine the stakes of art, and the broader critical culture, including the work of other artists at Nsukka and elsewhere, arrayed against the politics and policies of the dictatorship that raised corruption to statecraft and impoverished the citizenry. By every measure, Obiora Udechukwu's Tycoon and Stevedores, painted in 1980, is an impressive work, not the least because of the orchestration of complementary colors, as the fact that it is optically pleasant. Against a background that shifts from lower section of cloudy mix of carmine and alizarin crimson and cadmium orange to the cadmium yellow and orange top. A cluster of blue-green figures sprout from the bottom into a tight, unstable bubble topped by a massive head. While the pictorial composition and narrative might not be easy to untangle, the title invites us to do just that. The flat and nondescript red areas do not offer as much, they don't offer as much, except for the stylized hand bag suspended in mid-air. But it is the figural mass that holds the painting's subject. Here we see 4 figures with the body of the one in front in full view, the other 3 partially behind, all carrying massive sacks on their shoulders. There might be others hidden under their loads. A head with a tall hat, perhaps indicating someone of a different status, locks in the left corner. And you can see the hat that this figure is a chiefly hat. Udechukwu has taken liberties with his representational tactic. Beside the rapidly drawn outlines, dry brushwork, and thinly applied paint, the figures are rendered in a way that suggests emphasis on the expressive power of the organic line rather than anatomical fidelity. Except for one instance, there are no perpendicular lines. Rather, every movement tends to a curve such that the sinuous lines of the heavy sacks create a visual cadence echoed by the 2 billowing arcs above that seem weighted by a large head. We soon realize that this head is that of a man dressed in Yoruba ashoke cap that you see on the left. His eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses, his thick lips holding a large cigar belching distinctively red smoke. We also realize from the spiral motifs on the sleeve of one of his sleeves that he is wearing a dress made of what might be expensive lace. His stubbly hand keeping his business bag in aerial suspension as if by some magnetic or magical power. Here is a man wearing the flowing abada, the dress of choice for wealthy and powerful men of Lagos, Nigeria's financial capital, the center of maritime trade, and then seat of government. This setting is indicative by the horizontal boundary, or is indicated by the horizontal boundary of the cadmium yellow and orange at the top, which are boats and ships, so the maritime trade that goes on in Lagos. The stevedores, these are load carriers, and even the fifth figure, who might be their foreman, are inside the tycoon's body, trapped within the confines of his bloated self, as if their labor, constitute indigestible fodder to his insatiable craving. What is not in doubt is that by conflating the space within which the stevedores do their work and the fashionably dressed body of the big man, Udechukwu signals the exploitative nature of the relationship between the tycoon and stevedores. But why take up this particular subject in 1980? What response might it have had in Nigeria of that period, and who is the real target of this important painting? Well, Tycoon and Stevedores is Udechukwu's reflection on the capture of Nigeria's post-independent political economy by non-sovereign big men to fund their profligate and ostentatious lifestyles at the expense of the exploited masses. It moreover speaks to the crucial role played by this class in maintaining the socioeconomic imbalance and regimes of despotic and quasi-democratic governance overseen by the sovereign big man. Tycoon and Stevedores is also significant as it came at a point when Udechukwu reached an inflection point in the evolution of his pictorial mode and thematic concerns. As I will show shortly, the previous decade had seen him examining and in the process refining what I might call the aesthetic and rhetoric of the lyrical line, effectively moving away from painting to drawing. Tycoon and Stevedores was not only his last major canvas for another decade, it marked his emphatic turn from years of probing the devastating impact of the Biafran War of 1967 to 70 to sustained critical commentary on life and politics of the post-Biafra nation as he stumbled from a shaky Second Republic to a 15-year period of 3 brutal military dictatorships. In considering Udechukwu's work as I do today, let me note 2 important topics that it allows me to examine. First, it affords me the opportunity to address the art historical problem of distinguishing the modern and contemporary that I've raised in my previous work. For while it takes as its starting point the cultural identity focus of independence decade modernists, it is not so much in the service of a positivistic production of national culture as engaged in an insistent commentary on the malfeasance of post-colonial governmentality and its debilitating aftermath. Second, it allows me to examine the modes of address that is the rhetorical devices he and other Nigerian artists deployed to speak to the terrors and depredations of the sovereign and everyday big men. Let me begin with a brief recounting of Udechukwu's work leading up to 1980 and the historical context of the critical turn represented by Tycoon and Stevedores and similar work from that period. When Nigeria, with 250 ethnic groups, gained independence from Nigeria, from Britain in 1960, the reality of its demographic, cultural, and structural complexity soon became apparent. Its parliamentary system proved inadequate to manage the pressures of ethnic nationalism. And in 1966, a group of young army officers with revolutionary ambitions carried out an unsuccessful bloody coup that exerted enormous stress on the already weak ties that bound the country's constituent groups. A pogrom against Eastern Nigerians resident in the northern region led to the secession of the East as a Republic of Biafra in 1967, inevitably leading to the civil war in which up to 2 million children may have died due to starvation policy of the Nigerian government. Udechukwu, only 21 at the onset of the war, witnessed the devastation of that war in scores of drawings and paintings, haunting images of bombed out homes and emaciated children and traumatized populations produced behind the front lines might be, in fact, the most comprehensive perspective on the impact of that war by any artist. In the years following the defeat of Biafra, war refugees persisted as a theme, even as he explored new modalities of image making, from the realism of the earliest period to the later work inspired by the aesthetic and ethic of the line. In fact, Udechukwu's dual emphasis on a social vision initially forged by the war experience and on the rigorous investigation of and faith in the expressive and symbolic power of the organic line points to the ways post-independence political crisis might have fundamentally changed his relationship with and connection to the national culture orientation of the previous generation of artists, like Uche Okeke, his teacher. For in 1961, Uche Okeke began his own experiments with Igbo uli body drawing, inspired by his theory of natural synthesis, which called for, as did other artists around the continent, combining the formal resources of Western and African artistic traditions in order to develop a new post-colonial modern art. A competent poet himself, that is Okeke, he examined the structural and lyrical equivalence between Igbo folk song and uli drawing, and sought to reaffirm this transmedia connection in subsequent work for which he would gain national and international attention. By the mid-1960s, Udechukwu met Okeke and soon began his own research on Igbo uli art. With his exceptional draftsmanship and sophisticated poetic sensibility, Udechukwu advanced with unparalleled intellectual and technical rigor the formal properties of uli drawing, which resulted in what one might call a visual poetry that his drawing would become by the late 1970s. Udechukwu became familiar with the work of the poet Christopher Okigbo that had great impact on his art and poetry around 1966. Okigbo was an extraordinary poet known for his astonishing sampling of world poetic traditions, from the Greek tragedians to Virgil, to the Victorian Gerald Manley Hopkins, and the modernists, including Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. From the French symbolists Mallarmé to the Senegalese negritude poet Léopold Sédar Senghor. Okigbo equally mined African poetry from the Ijala Yoruba hunters to Akan and Igbo drumming and dirge performance. Indeed, because of his layered allusions, its refusal of easy or even unreliable interpretation, Okigbo's poetry is unquestionably post-symbolic, yet because of the level of condensation, suturing, and collaging of words and phrases, it is equally formalist, for the reader is often left in awe of the texture and sound of words, as well as by the silences that hold them in lyrical balance. In fact, it is this expressive abstraction in the service of poetic lyricism that made Okigbo think of his poetry primarily as an excursion into musical composition by means of textual ordering. Thus, whereas Okeke's work may have led Udechukwu to recognize the significance of Igbo Uli art and design in charting a new path within the context of modernist art, the sheer force of Okigbo's lyrical formalism and his symbolism opened up for Udechukwu the possibility of imagining drawing as a complex set of operations that depends on the dynamic balance of legible or meaningful form and evocative yet subjective graphic spatial gestures. Okigbo, in other words, allowed Udechukwu to see drawing as a form of poetic utterance. That is, an expressive statement that does not so much aspire to the realism of academic prose drawing as perpetually deferred the resolution of the tension between rigorous formalism and layered symbolism. Okigbo's poetry helped Udechukwu realize the graphic line, and that the graphic line, drawing's most pervasive element, can be a potent bearer of meaning, and that it can excite our senses through symphonic invocation of color, sound, and texture. In other words, he settled on a deliberate and intuitive deployment of his technical resources towards the formal refinement of pictorial elements until they approximate the lyrical abstraction of music and poetry. A third element in Okigbo's poetry, evident in his last collection of poems, Path of Thunder, is his deployment of his work to analyze the Nigerian crisis and prognosticate on its devastating consequences before the war, in which he died fighting for Biafra. I would argue that this willingness to draw on the expressive power of poetry for sociopolitical engagement is instrumental to the formation of Udechukwu's art and politics. When that war ended in 1970, Udechukwu returned to Nsukka, where he submitted a thesis in 1972 in which he documented Uli mural art and analyzed its elements, motifs, compositional, and design characteristics. And here's how he described his understanding of Uli in 1998. An analysis, and I'm quoting here, an analysis of Igbo drawing and painting reveals that space, line, pattern, brevity, and spontaneity seem to be the pillars on which the whole tradition rests. It is these same qualities that I strive both intuitively and intellectually to assimilate in my work. The art historian and artist Chike Anyako, who also taught at Nsukka, puts it in a more poetic language, for according to him, at its best, Uli is the rhythmic temper of line, like a melodic tone plucked from the thumb piano. In Uli, the line dances, spirals into diverse shapes, elongates, attenuates, thickens, swells, slides, thins, and fades out from a slick point, leaving an empty space that sustains it with mute echoes in which silence is part of the sound. As Udechukwu experimented with these formal qualities of Uli, the ambition of his drawing changed from describing the world in visual prose to creating alternate image worlds through the sheer reliance on the dynamic dialogue of line and negative space. The arcing lines, the decorative motifs in both his semantically abstract compositions or in highly simplified figural forms all testify to the impact and influence of Uli design and pictorial sensibility. His post-war drawings thus constitute Udechukwu's inaugural attempts to create lyrical poetry with the graphic line, decorative motif, and flat pictorial space as his syntax. This process, executed with greater focus and conviction, reached full elaboration by the end of that decade. Udechukwu's insistence on the expressive properties of the virtuosic lyrical line earned him substantial critical acclaim. In 1981, for instance, the novelist Chinua Achebe described Udechukwu as the poet of the clean and eloquent line, whose clearness of vision, and this is Achebe's words, is sustained by honesty and humane compassion. I have no doubt that Achebe saw the artist as a poet of drawing that had reached a level of formal purity on account of his ascetic yet elegant lines, which in turn implied clarity of artistic vision. Achebe seems to have understood Udechukwu's work as engaged at that point with inventive formal play, but also that it had attained the status of inspired utterance similar to Okibo's poetry. But this raises a crucial question. Of what conceptual value is the clear, unambiguous, and assertive line in Udechukwu's drawing, about which he wrote in 1980 when he painted Tycoon and Steve Dawes, especially given that it does not produce unequivocal images, that is, easily apprehensible images of the sort we often associate with pictorial realism? It seems to me that the clean, elegant line, apart from helping Udechukwu stake a claim to Uli art and Igbo culture, as did his mentor Uche Okeke, serves as a graphic manifestation of what he called clarity of vision and lucidity of expression. It is the assertive mark of the uncompromising and self-assured artistic imagination. Now, having dwelled at length with this matter of form and aesthetics in Udechukwu's work, let me turn slightly away in a different tangent to consider how, as the experience, if not memories of war receded by the 1970s, he increasingly focused on the broader Nigerian socio-political landscape. Few years after the end of the Biafran War, the victorious Nigerian government, led by General Gowon, benefited from the oil crisis caused by the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. For a country that until then had not fully exploited the oil discovered in the Niger Delta in 1956, the 1973 global crisis dramatically changed its economic profile. The regime went big increased national spending tenfold, and threw its weight around as an international power and leader of Africa. Gowon's regime splurged on civil servants, you wish we were doing that right now, embarked on large-scale capital projects, but was taken out in a coup d'etat that brought the charismatic Murtala Mohammed to power in 1975. Mohammed, an ardent nationalist, stung by the failing national income after the Middle East War, decimated the civil service, as we're seeing now, in an anti-corruption campaign, but was assassinated in 1976, replaced by yet another, General Obasanjo, who scaled up what was already going to be an expensive national vanity project. And that is the 1977 Second World Black and African Festival of Art and Culture, aka Festac 77. Despite that the country's economic fundamentals were inherently weak, it threw open the gates for a global party of Black peoples, staged stupendous musical and theatrical performances in the showpiece magnified copy of a Bulgarian theater. And it is said that General Gowon loved the Bulgarian structure because it resembled a military cap. Well, in 1979, the Second Republic, stage managed by Obasanjo, the third dictator, came to power, heralding new political class and economic elite, inebriated by a second oil boom caused by the Iranian Revolution, taking wasteful spending to new heights, hollowing out a supposedly wealthy nation. The newly elected Shehu Shagari, once in power, dusted up the long-delayed plan for a new federal capital in Abuja and opened the coffers to fund massive project said to be, at one point, the world's largest urban construction site, invariably worsening the country's economic profile. So it's within this context that we make sense of Udechukwu's Tycoon and Steve Dawes, and the equally poignant Al-Hajjah from 1978 as declamatory comments on this new class of non-sovereign big men, and yes, women, who built their social power through corrupt wealth accumulation. The tycoon, fattened by the labor of the exploited longshoremen, and the socially recognizable businesswoman who has supposedly made the expensive pilgrimage to Mecca, and whose turban-like headgear drips with ornaments, her hand and taloned fingers weighted down by surplus jewelry. They both cut an impressive image of arrogant wealth. The themes of Udechukwu's exhibition in Nigeria and Europe during the first half of the 1980s is quite telling, for their emphasis on socio-political commentary and critique of the big man's unregulated and corruptive power. In 1981, he presented No Water that traveled to 3 Nigerian venues, and in which we see remarkably elegant compositions that nevertheless dealt with the rather basic problem of lack of potable water by vast segments of a nation supposedly awash with petrodollars. Following the testamentary posture of No Water, Udechukwu's 1985 exhibition, Rhythms of Hunger, at the Commonwealth Institute in London, referenced the impoverishment of the masses in an increasingly mismanaged economy run by civilian and military elite. In the works presented there and at other venues in Nigeria during this period, two topics recur. One, a continuation of his critique of the exploitative and corrupt big man, which we see in drawings depicting the familiar cigar or pipe-smoking big man riding a horse, the stomach of which is filled with destituted underclass, or a group of them with their chiefly and clerical power hats and the ever-present tycoon and alhaja to the right, cavorting, perhaps fighting for government contracts and kickbacks. That's bribe that you get when you give a contract to contractors. Sullied by the muck of corruption, the hapless masses squished to a corner. Although Lagos was the country's economic and political capital, Abuja was the locus of official corruption. A rising city without industries or any meaningful productive sector, but which readily bestowed stupendous wealth to contractors with only the right connections and who were adept at the art of bribery. This is also the portrait of the city in Udechukwu's road to Abuja. If there is any indication of a road to the future seat of government, it is the two concave lines, one grazing the artist's signature rising to the left, terminating in the midsection of the vertical line, picture line, plane. The second, a double line blocked by what appears to be a bloated body of a dead beggar. An open truck stuffed with standing human cargo turns off the road, and above it, a woman cooks on a wood-fired stove under the street lights. The main characters in the composition, the lords of the city, are the turbaned figure clutching a bag filled with British, US, and Nigerian currencies, as well as the Christian cross and Muslim prayer beads, as if to announce the symbiosis of faith and capital. Following this, Al-Hajjah, judging by the high-heeled lady's footwear, is a tycoon in business suit. And further back, a Christian cleric. Overseeing this motley crowd is an imperious vulture on a lamppost. In the distance, another vulture sits on a skeletal structure dominating the landscape. The road to Abuja is perilous. The city itself, a schizophrenic place of poverty, suffering, and death, a citadel of corruption and fast money. It is the city of economic and political vultures. Udechukwu's exhibitions and artworks, focused as they are on socio-political commentary, had everything to do with a 5-year period that straddled the raucous, massively rigged second federal elections of 1983 that returned Shehu Shagari to power, the bloodless coup that ushered in the draconian regime of General Muhammad Buhari, and his no-nonsense sidekick, Tunde Idiabon, who was carrying out the really massive stuff while the president stood back. And about that. And then in 1985, coup led by General Ibrahim Babangida, who with his beguiling, dimpled smile declared a new order shorn of the brutality of the Buhari regime, notorious for its war against indiscipline program designed to straighten up the unruly and insubordinate citizenry. This was the Nigeria about which Chinua Achebe published his incendiary The Trouble with Nigeria in 1983. With his characteristic directness, Achebe cataloged the evils that had beset the country right from the colonial period, but especially since independence, not the least of which were corruption, tribalism, mediocrity, political opportunism, social injustice, and he blamed it all on the absence of visionary, non-self-serving, just leadership. The trouble with Nigeria, a nation of perpetual potentiality, but in reality a sorry disappointment, Achebe argued, had everything to do with the malfeasance of its military and civilian big men. It is also the same Nigeria that the poet Niyi Oshundare, a contemporary of Udechukwu, devoted his collection of poetry, Songs from the Marketplace, also published in 1983, in which one of the poems, Siren, called out the obnoxious power play of the big man. Siren, siren, siren. Police acrobats on motorbikes, wielding whips with consummate dispatch. The road must be cleared at once. For which worthy ruler ever shares the right way? Siren, 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 the clangorous convoy of power and power brokers conditioned in Mercedes back, far, very far from the maddening crowd. For poems like this, which Oshundare continued to publish in national newspapers and for which he gained national renown, he was frequently visited by state security to explain their meaning and to whom they referred. About those encounters, Oshundare later noted with not so subtle sarcasm, quote, "By the time I realized that the Nigerian security apparatus had become quite sophisticated, quite literate indeed," because they are asking for meanings of poetry. Well, Achebe and Oshundare represented an important aspect of Nigerian literature committed to the role of art in the making of the good and just national community. But where Achebe argued that the artist and writer, like the teacher, must educate their people about their past with all its complications, about the present as a political reality, about their possible futures, all with the goal of building a better society, Oshundare identified with the bard, or the minstrel, who through his musical and lyrical art serves as the conscience and bearer of sometimes bitter but salvific truths of society. Udechukwu shared with Oshundare this idea of the poet minstrel as a social critic, which in fact is deeply embedded in the traditions of many Nigerian and West African societies. And he frequently demonstrated this through his drawings and paintings depicting the minstrel armed with only his voice and his obo, the gourd resonator, or the obo akwala, the stringed bow. In his Song of Sorrow of 1989, the minstrel lowers his head in sorrow and, as the single line, by the way, an epic display of inspired draftsmanship, shows, as this line shows, he is crouched on the bare floor. But I wish to call attention to the figure on the right, for he is no destitute. Instead, his chiefly cap, and especially his itchy marks, facial scarification, which until the early 20th century sanctified men and women who attained high social and sacred status in Igbo society, suggests that his music and the truths to which he testified in his lyrics also serve as his protective cloak against the impurity of the big men's arrogant powers. But why the gathering of critical voices that we see in Udechukwu's work and in that of his literary contemporaries during and after the mid-1980s? Well, the answer must be the coming of General Ibrahim Babangida in 1985, welcomed by some Nigerians yearning for relief from the Buhari's regime's obsession with enforcing military discipline on the entire citizenry. In his address to the nation on August 27, 1985, Babangida, to the cautious delight of Nigerians, announced the repeal of Buhari's regime's dreaded Decree Number 4 that criminalized unpleasant publications and even rumors. Released politicians jailed since the end of the Second Republic and moved to stem the worsening economic crisis. However, within 1 year, he introduced the IMF Structural Adjustment Program with the attendant austerity measures, raising mass impoverishment and collapse of the educational sector, precipitating unprecedented brain drain. But also Dele Giwa, one of Nigeria's most prominent journalists, who was said to be working on a story involving drug running, implicating the dictator's wife, was assassinated with a letter bomb. And in the international community, Nigeria had become a de facto narco state run by highly placed government persons. Moreover, to charm Nigerians further, Babangida announced in his first year an elaborate program of transition to democracy, except that he would take the country through ridiculous processes of deception that could have made a fascinating political thriller. Scheduling and postponing election initially set for 1990, then postponed 4 times until it finally held in 1993. And when the results apparently showed the businessman Moshood Abiola poised for a landslide win, Babangida annulled the elections, apparently not ready to relinquish power, thus plunging the nation into a crisis of unprecedented magnitude. It is for these political maneuvers that he referred to himself as evil genius, though Nigerians prefer to call him Maradona after the Brazilian football star's hand of God goal at the 1984 World Cup quarterfinals between England and Brazil. But Babangida's reputation as a cunning, equivocating ruler surprised many Nigerians who had not forgotten his declared commitment to foolproof democratic process in 1986, or shocked others still enamored by his affable public disposition or even his killer gap-toothed smile. Well, Udechukwu, as early as 1985, saw him instead as a chameleon. In a soft ground print dominating the sky with 3 figures representing civilian representatives of Nigeria's main ethnic groups, and in between, a disappearing mass of hapless citizenry. And in 1989, as the transition process was heating up, along with strikes by students and workers beleaguered by the structural adjustment economy, Udechukwu's inkwash drawing, What the Serpent Did Not Say, depicted the general as a hybrid. Despite his prominent military beret, one half of his body is in civilian attire. The other uniformed half sported an epaulette decorated with many symbols. Combined with the snake, whose invisible forked tongue is an enduring symbol of deceit, lovingly lolling around about the general. The image here is of a ruler whose utterance, whose word cannot be trusted. And if you thought of his political footwork artful and his bonhomie benign, a close look at his beret badge, showing two vultures guarding two emaciated figures, the deadly consequence for the nation of his power play. Let me note, as I'm sure you might be wondering, that in deploying his work as a tool for social commentary, he was not alone. And I'm not simply thinking of other poets and writers of his generation, including the previously mentioned Oshundare or Tunde Fatunde, whose dynamic work in Pidgin English, including Oga na Thief Man, that is, the big man is a thief, or Festus Iyayi, whose novels involved violence, included violence, insistently explored the devastating impact of elite class corruption on the society. Indeed, some of the more prominent artists of the 1980s joined Udechukwu in his critique of the unprecedented institutionalization of corruption in Babangida's Nigeria. But their modes of address differed. Consider, for instance, Gani Odutokun, who in the 1980s generally explored cultural and genre themes, yet in 1989, 88, and 90, at the height of the Babangida's regime, created a cycle of allegorical paintings on the theme of confrontation between an imperious king and the republic. In one of his early works from the cycle, the king shares a joke with his general, rendered in a florid brushwork and polychromatic palette he had developed years before. We see the bare-chested, powerfully built king with his self-satisfied smile, holding a crown in one hand as he removes a combat helmet with the other. His solemn-faced general holds a mirror for him. But whatever the joke, the scene is one of a former soldier's auto-coronation. Another painting from 1990, The King, Queen, and the Republic, the royal couple seen quietly moonlighting in 1988, flee the Republic, expelled by a sword-bearing Republic. But setting aside Udechukwu's lyrical realism or Odutokun's pictorial allegory, Olu Ogwibe, a former student of Udechukwu at Nsukka who had gained national renown as a young, angry poet and painter, was decidedly confrontational. In 1989, he presented an exhibition of his work a block away from the dictator's Lagos residence. Alongside graffiti paintings on fiber mats, he prominently installed the work, and the beast had the face of one I know. A pen drawing of an amorphous beast, the head of which is collaged face of General Babangida. Such was the magnetic repulsion of the work that few journalists dared linger in front of it, and media descriptions of it were advisedly allusive. Moreover, in the poem, A Gathering Fear, published in the exhibition catalog, we read, generals, sergeants, warlords who feed on blood, carrion eaters, pallbearers, tin god who reap where they did not sow. Your shrines are empty. Patriarchs of crumbling quarters, presidents for life, founding fathers who founded only their own estates. Your shrines are empty. But for all the artwork, for all the fear it elicited among its audience, Babangida's men, for all I know, neither visited the show nor called for the artist to explain the work. So as I conclude, let me briefly mention Udechukwu's experience with the last dictatorship of General Sani Abacha, who, unlike Babangida, was reclusive, profoundly sinister, but also as fabulously corrupt. A year after the regime judicially murdered Ken Saro-Wiwa, the writer and activist, Udechukwu was briefly detained along with 7 other professors at Nsukka and charged to a tribunal for sedition and, of all things, arson. Their real crime was what the big man friend of a dictator administrator of the university saw as their refusal to be of good behavior toward him. In any case, on release from jail, Udechukwu went into exile, and on arrival in the United States in 1998, created a series of drawings and paintings, including The Dark Days, on which I will conclude. Remarkable for its pictorial quality, its lovingly and deftly worked dark surface, textured with patterns reminiscent of the mural markings of Igbo Uli painting. But to the left, within an oval enclave, are several pictographically rendered figures of prisoners packed into the airless space. White light behind a barred window touching a prismatic line dividing the exterior and interior space refracts into rainbow beams, bathing the enclosure in a gossamer glow. In this dark night of the big man, Udechukwu seems to say, the power of truth and light will prevail. And it did. As Udechukwu was finishing the Dark Days work, Sani Abacha suddenly died in office. He was Nigeria's last dictator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for a few questions. Would anybody like to field the first one?
So thank you. That was a really great talk. So my question is, you talked about how Udechukwu's work was shown in many galleries across Nigeria. Could you talk a little bit more about that? I was curious who would have seen the work exactly, and then where are these works now? Whose collection? Are these part of his own private collection? Or are they in museums within Nigeria or private collectors? So I was just wondering who owned them today.
You would notice that I made the point of how Ologbibe's work that was shown just down the road from the dictator's residence, the work that was the most confrontational of all of the work that came out of Nigeria during this period, was ignored. But the poets were the ones that got into trouble. What this points to, as I have often argued, is that art as we know it is often not really taken that seriously by governments, dictatorships. And you would wonder why. It's not because the works are not powerful and confrontational and all of that. It's simply who sees it, right? Such work circulates where among the elite circles, the very same people who are the big men and big women. And so what are their revolutionary potential, right? They don't get to the masses, and that's what's feared. That's why journalists or writers whose work tend to percolate more among the populations tend to be feared more. That's my theory. I might be wrong. But as far as I know, other than what happened at Nsukka at the university, which had a slightly different genealogy, he was not arrested because of his work. He was arrested because he was one of the teachers who refused to sign an oath of undertaking, right? So my sense of all the creative people in their generation, it was writers and journalists that were arrested, not visual artists. As far as where the works are, as with the fate of artists, African artists of his generation, they haven't traveled well, right, into public and museum collections. In part, on the Nigerian end, you don't have that much of any, meaningful, if you say, museum system. And so they are not being collected there, except in one or two. The national collection that is in Lagos is in decrepit condition, so thank God, much of his work was not in that national collection. But in recent years, and this has to do with what has happened since the 1990s with a lot more exposure of the work of artists like him, they've lately started making their ways into collections like the MoMA collected one of his most impressive work a couple of years ago, and other university museum collections, and yeah. Okay. Yes.
Thanks so much. I really enjoyed the talk. I was wondering if you'd speak a little bit more about his line, Udechukwu's line. I'm interested in the potential for caricature and maybe satire in his work, and sort of the relationship between that form of image making. If I'm not mistaken, I believe some of his drawings ended up in newspapers as well. Is that, am I wrong there?
Yeah, he was not an illustrator, but there are artists that he inspired.
Okay.
That the one artist of his generation who had similar character of line is Dele Jegede.
Yes.
Who was a newspaper cartoonist
Right.
and an illustrator. Yes, so there's that is an important concern, right? But at the same time, and this is why it's important to provide proper context, that within the context of an aesthetic and signifying system that is connected to this traditional image-making mode, the idea of caricature, becomes, actually mute, in the sense that if you know where these lines are coming, this is, these elegant lines are manifestations of the highest form of, aesthetics in this tradition. But if you're looking at it from, an ethic, view, right, of this same work, it can be lost in translation, right? So, and this is why it's important that if you're looking at any art anywhere, to have a better a good sense of where it's coming from. So there will be that concern when works travel, right? The same concern that you would have if work from another part of the world gets to a different part and they're reading it differently because of their visual and aesthetic traditions. So that would be my way of responding to that in this space, there are multiple traditions of image making that can collide, and a lot of intentionalities or histories then get missed in the process.
That's super interesting. I'm just, the whole thing about the elegance and the lyrical line,
Yeah.
with its, how these forms are embedded in deep, well-respected traditions of art making, it's almost as if it's elevating what is often seen as a lower form in Western cultures through caricature. And so there's an interesting kind of value system being produced here that I really appreciate that you're saying. It's incredibly context specific. It just makes me think too about this time period where in Europe and the United States, there's this explosion of interest in figurative painting and return to sort of the visual after conceptual art and all of that.
Yeah.
And so I'm just, in terms of this high-low distinction that's being discussed in various parts of the world at this time, it sets up a very interesting model.
Yeah, I think it's important. I think part of that conversation has to always, especially since we're already talking about the 1980s, the globality of art, both the modern and contemporary, we needed and still need to take that seriously, in the sense that if you think of what was happening in North Africa, the turn to abstraction by artists there, and you miss the point, right, or the historical context of their own journey from an abstraction that comes out of the iconic mandate of Islam, and think that, oh, they must have been, jolly good inheritors of the, the post-Cubist abstraction and so forth, and then they are late, right? They are late to the party, the abstract party, and stuff like that. Then you miss the point, right? So I think that that's why we need more studies, right? So that when you go into a museum and you see two kinds of abstractions, what are they, right? Are they coming from the same places? Or if not, how might we understand how they are relating or not with each other in that moment in time? Sure.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Kind of going off of what both of you were saying, I can't help but see similarities with artists working in South America in the 60s and 70s. Especially there's a group that did works on paper and focused on monstritos, or like little monsters, and it's very similar, the line work and the monsters or the beasts. So I know they had correspondence with Eastern Europe and the Caribbean. So I just wonder if you've come about, if you've seen any evidence of kind of correspondence between them, possibly.
No, at least as far as all the artists that I knew working in the Nigerian and even West African, North African contexts, they were not looking in that direction. One thing I didn't bring up in the lecture, for instance, is that Obiora Udechukwu was an ardent reader of Chinese literati paintings, and even wrote an article, a journal article about the correspondences, between Li and Uli, this connection between image and text, and the value of the line, right? He was very much interested in that tradition. And in fact, in the art class that we took in those days, we'll begin by reading Tower of Painting there at Nsukka, right? To draw on a completely different tradition, right? Working with ink and brush, right, of that tradition. So they were looking in very different directions, but I can't think of any who was looking to Latin American, context at that point in time. Okay, all right. Thank you, guys.